Right. Welcome back. We're going to finish up. This is part two of lecture three, which is covering biological basis of behavior, or chapter 3 in our textbook. And I am going to finish up with how the brain influences behavior. We'll talk about different structures of the brain. And as we talk about the brain, I also want to tie that into what we're talking about in chapter 4, which is sensation and perception. So what we'll talk about is the different structures of the brain, their different functions, and how those functions contribute to how we behave, how we think, how we feel. There are different parts of the brain that control the autonomic system, right? So our respiration, our heart rate, um, the blood pressure, all of those different things. And then you have other um, uh, voluntary things that we can control with the prefrontal cortex, which we'll talk about, and how our emotions are processed in our kind of the limbic system of our brain, kind of the midbrain, which we'll talk about. Okay. But the first thing that we'll discuss is, how do we get to the point where we understand what parts of the brain function and how they function and what they do for us in our human experience? One of the biggest things that we've done over the course of the last couple centuries is we're trying to find out through some of the most primitive techniques, and now even so much of the more advanced techniques, how the brain uses different parts of our body, and how different parts of our body are used to operate, right? And how the brain operates different parts of our body. Excuse me. So you have several different techniques. When we talk about research. We talked about physiology, how the brain influences the body, and part of how we determine and do research on the body and the brain is we look at imaging, right? When you have a sprained ankle and you want to go get an MRI, the MRI is looking at the structure of the ankle, looking at the soft tissue in your ankle to see if there's any damage. Are there any ligament damage? Is there any structural damage to it? And so with the brain, there are imaging techniques that allow us to look at the brain, to look at the structure of the brain, and then also to look to see what parts of the brain are functioning, what parts of the brain are active. And so we'll talk about several of them here next. But again, lesioning is probably one of the most primitive techniques, one of the earliest techniques, and that was based on just destroying a piece of the brain to see how destroying a piece of the brain would affect functioning of a human being. We talked about in chapter 2, in the research chapter, how Phineas, Phineas Gage, he had an accident where an iron rod was shot through his skull, which removed a good portion of his frontal cortex or his prefrontal lobe. And when that happened, certain things changed in his behavior eventually, right? And so just by removing or destroying a piece of the brain, you start to see how parts of the brain influence different aspects of our behavior. Um, Electrical stimulation of the brain. We send a weak, very, very weak electrical current into the brain structure. So you have these probes, and it's usually done to animals more so than human beings. But you shock a particular part of the brain. So in the parietal lobe, and we'll talk about this, the parietal lobe is responsible for movement, and movement and touch, right? So if I shock a particular part of the parietal lobe and I see the hand or the leg jump, I know that I've shocked. And the part of that brain is responsible for the movement of our limbs, the voluntary movement of our limbs. So again, just being very, very scientific, we're looking at very systematic ways to study what parts of the brain influence parts of behavior and senses and all of those different things. Okay. You got CAT scans or CT scans, you have MRIs, you have PET scans. All of these are looking at different structures. And then for the PET scan, we call the positron emission tomography. It's looking at radioactive markers in the brain to see what parts of the brain are pulling the different activity over the course of time. So it takes different images over the course of time. And so if you're looking at this image, let me get my pointer. So if you're looking at the image here, the red and the bright red and orange regions, that's where you see most of the activity. And again, they take different It's a different metabolic rate. So when our brains, just like when our muscles are using and are moving, they're using blood and oxygen and they're metabolizing blood, sugar, all of those different things together. And so when your body is really, really pumped up and you're moving parts of the muscle, you're going to see, if you do a PET scan, you're going to see very, very bright red and orange areas that are, again, really, really active. And again, that kind of constitutes the activity in that part of the body or in the brain. Okay. The other most advanced technique, and probably one of the most common now, is what we call the functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI. And this monitors blood flow and oxygen consumption in the brain. One of the advantages that it has over any of the other techniques is it provides a better image, very, very sharp image of what's happening in the brain structurally and when we talk about activity-wise. Okay, it produces a three-dimensional picture, very, very high resolution. So it's very, very different than what we'd see in a CAT scan and the MRI. The MRI is looking at the structure, and the fMRI is looking at the activity and structure simultaneously. So you'll be able to see by using the CT scan and using the MRI, and the fMRI, you're able to see any abnormalities in the brain structure and any abnormalities in the activity of the brain that's being stimulated by the external stimuli that's presented, right? So the CT scan, MRI is looking at the structure. Again, just like I talked about when you had a sprained ankle, it's looking at the structure of maybe a healthy structure of an ankle than one that's been injured, and they compare the two to see where the different ligaments or different areas of that particular area of the body is impacted. Okay. Again, they look at the structure because different mental disorders or mental illnesses present themselves very differently in brain structure. So someone who is schizophrenia may have a different brain structure than someone who is functioning normally, has a normal brain function. And so you'll see different areas of the brain that might be different structurally and also activity-wise in human beings. Okay. So as we talk about different structures of the brain, again, the research is looking at imaging of different structures of the brain. Let's talk about those different areas and those different structures. One of the most primitive parts of the brain is what we consider this midbrain here. The midbrain and the hindbrain, those are the most primitive structures. So this brainstem is what we call the reptilian brain. And the reptilian brain is the brain that is responsible for all of our autonomic, involuntary functions of our body, right? So heart rate or heartbeat, respiration, sweating, it controls all of those different things that are kind of in the unconscious, right? So this brainstem is the first to develop in a human being, right? So you have pons, we'll talk about the medulla, the cerebellum, all of these different functions. They have different functions and they control different parts of our body kind of involuntarily, okay? But again, this is the hindbrain, and the kind of the brainstem is connected to the spinal cord, which then again radiates out into the peripheral nervous system that we talked about in the previous lecture to kind of control different parts of our body. Okay, but again, you have your hindbrain, you have your midbrain. Your midbrain is kind of that limbic system. It's controlling your emotional parts of the brain. It's kind of helping to, it's kind of integrating what we receive from the outside world into the brain. And then you have your prefrontal cortex. This cortex at the top here, this is kind of the last part of the brain to develop. It's the newest part of the brain, and it's responsible for, rational thought, how we control, the senses of the body, touch, and all those other areas of the brain. I mean, all those other areas of the human experience is really responsible for that. Okay. So with the hindbrain and the midbrain, again, this is the brainstem and the spinal cord. The brainstem contains the hindbrain, includes the cerebellum, the medulla, and the pons. The medulla is really, really responsible for regulating any of the circulation on our body, muscle tone, breathing. Again, it's really important because again, if I did not have anything else, right? I have to be able to breathe. I have to have regular circulation. My heart needs to be pumping, and the medulla is really, really important for that. So the medulla oblongata is extremely important for, again, those primitive functions of just survival. And they call it the reptilian brain because it's the basic principles of and functioning of the human being. Okay, the pons, that is again part of the midbrain, but it is responsible for involved in sleep and arousal, right? So being able to sleep, the circadian rhythm, all of those things are controlled by the pons. And then the last structure that we'll talk about in the kind of the brainstem, located in the brainstem, is the cerebellum. And the cerebellum is extremely important for fine muscle movement. And when we drink alcohol, that's what happens in the brain. So when alcohol is introduced to the system and is consumed, the cerebellum and other parts of the brain are then slowed down. You know, alcohol is a depressant. We'll talk about that in a couple of chapters. But when it's a depressant, it slows down the activity in the brain, which is why you have slow motor function, slurred speech, vision is blurred. Again, all of those different things are again functioning and inhibiting functioning of the brain, which then slows the brain down and the function of the brain. So again, really, really important that when you consume alcohol, if you're of age to drink alcohol, to be very responsible with that, because again, it does affect different parts of the brain in a very negative and depressed way. And then you have what we call the midbrain. The midbrain lies between the hindbrain and the forebrain. The forebrain, again, that's cerebellum, the cerebrum, the cerebral cortex. That the midbrain is really responsible for your hearing, your vision, all of the sensory processes that we talk about. So we talk about the thalamus, the hypothalamus. The thalamus is that control center. Everything has to go pass through the thalamus, aside from the sense of smell, but everything else, all the senses pass through the thalamus to, again, integrate into what we smell. And the hypothalamus is responsible for memory, hippocampus, and learning. And so we'll talk about all those different structures as we move forward. Okay. So again, one of the largest and most complicated regions of the brain, and it's complicated because a lot of the different structures of the brain, we're still trying to figure out how they function, what they do, what they control. And so that's why it's really one of the most complicated. But the thalamus, like I talked about before, all of the sensory information is passed from the external into the brain through the thalamus. And it is kind of that center that it pushes information to different parts of the body, or different parts of the brain and different parts of the body, so that we respond in an optimal and efficient way, right? The only sensory information that's not passed through the thalamus is the sense of smell. But everything must pass through the thalamus to get to the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex lets us know what we see, what we hear, what we're touching. All of that is based on and integrated through the thalamus. The hypothalamus, again, is more near the forebrain, and it helps to regulate all of our basic biological needs to survive, right? So it works in conjunction with everything in the midbrain, right? Everything in the brainstem, right? It's one of the most. It's still, again, in the early part of the development of the brain. The hypothalamus, thalamus are really, really important, and they are stacked on top of one another. Okay, and then you have what we call the limbic system. And the limbic system, I'm going to share a video that gives you an idea of how you can look at the brain. But there's a hand model that shows you the different parts of the brain, right? So if you fold your thumb in, right, this thumb area is considered the limbic system, right? The hand or the palm is considered your brain, right? Your brain stem, that's the brain, that's the basic functions of the body. And then you have your emotions, and you have the way you interpret emotions, your fear response, your amygdala is there, right? So you're looking at fear and how you again control the emotions of the body, right? And then if you fold your fingers over the top, this is the cerebrum, right? This is the cerebrum. You have your brainstem, the limbic system, and then you have the cerebrum. This front portion here is the prefrontal cortex. In the back that's your occipital lobe. On the side here, you have your temporal lobe, and we'll talk about those. And then over the top of the brain, you have your parietal lobe. And again, we'll talk about those different areas and what they contribute to. But the limbic system, again, is along the border between the cerebral cortex and kind of those deeper subcortical areas. And it regulates all of our endocrine function, right? The feeding, reproduction, caring for young, the fight or flight response, all of those are located in the limbic system. And this is also the location of our various pleasure centers that we experience, right? If we're eating, we have the pleasure of eating. Sexual experience is also located in the limbic system, right? So all of these are kind of those basic behaviors that are needed for survival. And the limbic system, right, is responsible for that. Responsible for mediating those areas and how we function. Okay. The cerebrum, we talked about the fold. So everything on top is the cerebrum. That is the newest part of the brain. That's the last part of the brain to develop. Again, that is extremely important for all of our complex mental activities, including learning, remembering, thinking, and consciousness, right? Inside the middle in the limbic system, you have the hippocampus, which is also important for memory. But again, when we talk about the cerebrum, this is for all of the executive function, making all the major decisions, logic, rational thinking, decision making, all of that is developed here in the front, prefrontal, the cerebral cortex. And then we'll talk about the cerebral hemispheres, the left and the right brain, and how they are used in different ways, right? But they work in an integrated fashion to give us our functioning and human function, right? So we have our cerebral hemispheres. You have the left and you have the right. If you're looking at my pointer, right? And then it's separated, right? And this red region is considered the cerebral cortex. And the cerebral cortex connects the two hemispheres. Each hemisphere is divided into 4 lobes, and we'll talk about those 4 lobes here on the next slide. But again, you have your cerebral hemispheres. That's where we get the left and the right brain type of person, right? And so we'll talk about that as we move forward. So again, like we talked about before, each of the hemispheres is broken up into 4 different lobes, right? So you have your sensory areas, you have your motor areas, and you have your association areas, right? So there are 4 different lobes, and you have your occipital lobe. Your occipital lobe contains the primary visual cortex, and again, that is controlling the vision. And when we talk about sensation and perception in chapter 4, we'll talk about how the occipital lobe contributes to, again, our sense of sight. Then you have your parietal lobe, and the parietal lobe includes areas that register the sense of touch. So everything here in the parietal primary, this parietal lobe here, the green and the blue, right? So the primary is so much the sensory cortex, that's giving you a sense of touch, right? And then the primary motor cortex is also having to do with how our body moves, right? So different parts of this region are responsible for different movements. So the movement of the legs, the movement of the arms and the eyes. Okay. And then you have what we call the temporal lobe. So that's this yellow region located here. The temporal lobe, again, is located near the ears. And so that is for hearing. Okay. Contains all of our devoted processes for the auditory processing for hearing. Okay. And then the frontal lobe, which is one of the most important, it controls the movement of our muscles. It controls the movement of again, the sense of touch. All this prefrontal lobe right here is, again, control of the movement and the muscles in the body, okay? And then the very, very front, we'll talk about the prefrontal cortex. That's where we get our rational thought, our decision-making, all of the logic that we have that is part of the cerebral cortex and the cerebrum, okay? So like we talked about before, you have what we call the primary motor cortex, which is the blue region, and then you have the sensory cortex, which is the green region here. So the motor cortex, if you look here, every little part, and there's different sections of the motor cortex that are responsible for the movement of different parts of our body, right? So if I want to move my knees, my ankles, and my toes, there are certain areas in the brain where I'll be able to move my knees, my ankles, and my toes based on that particular area of the brain. Right? If you look at shoulders and wrists and the right finger, left finger, middle finger, thumb, again, and then also you see that different parts of the sensory cortex, the larger the body part, the more sensitive it is to touch. Right? So our lips are very, very sensitive. The face is very, very sensitive to touch. Our hands are very, very sensitive to touch, and they take up more area of the brain because again they are very, very sensitive to touch. The arms, your legs, your feet, They're less sensitive to touch, and so they don't require as much space and don't take up as much space on the body. But this diagram shows how much of the cortex is devoted to the movement of the limbs and to the senses of the body. Okay? So again, when we talk about the brain, and let me go back. When we talk about the brain, we talk about the different functions of the brain. Um, Research has shown that different areas of the brain are responsible for these different areas, right? So we're able to see swallowing and tongue, and if any of these areas are damaged, then you have difficulties moving or functioning in any of these areas, right? And so we have to be really mindful of that when we talk about the health and taking care of our brains. So what happens if our brain is damaged? What happens, right? Plasticity of the brain is extremely important. Research shows and has shown that when the brain has been damaged or is influenced in any way, there is what we call a plasticity of the brain. Our brain is able to heal itself. When Phineas Gage was injured with that iron rod that shot through his skull, he lost some functioning for a minute, but after a while, his brain was healing itself, and the neural connections were being able to regenerate. And the regeneration of new neurons in our brain is the process called neurogenesis. So our brain heals, and then as our brain heals, then the neural connections begin to regenerate. As we get older, the process of neurogenesis slows down. However, with the process of regeneration and the neurogenesis, it happens a little faster and easier as we're younger adults, adolescents, and younger children. And as we age, it slows down, but the process still happens, right? Because again, in our experience, also sculpts different features of the brain structure, right? So if we grow up in a very, very um, very complex and very stimulating, mentally stimulating environment, then our brain structure will change based on that. And if we grow up in a very, very less stimulating environment, our brain structure is different based on where we grow up, our experiences, and the environment we grow up in. Right? Damage to any sensory pathways or destruction of brain tissue can lead to neural reorganization. Right? So if some damage happens to my sensory cortex, right? And I'm unable to move my left hand. The brain has a way of compensating for some of the damage to different parts of the brain, and it picks up some of those neural connections. And then I may not be able to move my hand in the same way before injury, but I can move it eventually because again that neurogenesis takes place, right? So the brain is not a hardwired, it's not a hardwired structure, right? Neural wiring is really, really flexible and it's constantly evolving as we age, right? It slows down over a period of time, but it is continuously evolving as we age and the experiences we have in our life. Okay? So we'll move past this. But again, something to think about as we think about hardwired, right? Computer is really, really hardwired. When we think about the brain, it is, again, it's ever evolving, very, very flexible. So it says, how might plasticity and neurogenesis aid healing after experiencing a traumatic brain injury? Again, with brain injuries, if a particular part of the brain is damaged, neurogenesis, plasticity allows the brain to again evolve and become really, really flexible. And parts of the brain that might be damaged heal, and then neurogenesis takes place, and those neural connections then take part and regenerate and allow us to get that functioning back with brain injury that we see. Okay. So again, we talked about the different hemispheres of the brain. And the different hemispheres of the brain, research has been shown that they have different specializations. And we'll talk about the cerebral specializations here next. So what happens when we see something, we hear something, what happens, right? What happens in our brain? What are the different functions, right? So there are different hemispheres of our brain. You see the left hemisphere here, you see the right hemisphere here. They, again, have different functions. Everything that we see in the left hemisphere or left side of our visual system is being processed in the right side of our brain. And everything in the right side of our visual system is being processed in the left side of our brain. And the reason we're able to see one image is because those two parts of our brains or two sides of our brains then are integrated. And now we're able to, again, see one, right? But we're again, visualizing things and we're processing things with both sides of our brain, and then they come together to integrate those two things together, right? It says the split brain surgery, the corpus callosum is cut, and oftentimes, again, when you see this break here, right, the corpus callosum is that connection. And then sometimes for individuals who have epileptic seizures, they do sometimes do surgery where they sever the corpus callosum to then try to minimize the severity of the epileptic seizures. And sometimes the research has shown that that does happen, that it does work. But again, each hemisphere is connected to the opposite side of the body. So if I'm going to move my left hand, my right side of my brain is helping to move my left hand. Left side of my brain is helping to move my right hand, and vice versa. Right. So vision and hearing are a little more complex, and they involve both. But again, we do see that processing of the visual system in the right half and the right side of the visual field is processed. But again, they work together to integrate those two things together. So again, we talk about specialization, right? Specialization of the hemispheric specialization. Data does suggest that the two hemispheres are specialized. Each of them handles different types of cognitive tasks better than the other, right? So the left hemisphere is said to have been better processing with verbal processing, language, speech, reading, and writing. And the right hemisphere is used for more spatial, musical, and visual recognition tasks. So it's more of the creative side of the brain, right? So it has some superiority in those tasks. It also, including the perception of our emotion when we see things or hear things or see things that are very, very visually stimulating, right? So again, the left hemisphere, very, very technical. Right hemisphere, very, very spatial, music, kind of the nonverbal processing and emotions, kind of the more sensitive part of the human experience. Okay. So again, we talked about the right hemisphere, the expression of our emotions, our emotional intelligence, our creativity is in the right side of the brain. And research has shown that, again, there is some specialization. Both sides of our brain, again, do work to, again, process our language, process the expression of our emotion and our imagination and creativity. However, there is specialization that the right side does it a little better than the left side, right? The left side does, works with numbers and language and analytical thinking and our logic. And again, both of them work together to give us the human experience that we experience as we move through the development of our lives. Okay. The next part that we'll talk about is the endocrine system. So we talked about the limbic system, and the limbic system is responsible for the expression of our emotion, how we feel, with the amygdala is responsible for our fear response. What do we feel when we have something that's evoking some sadness or a very traumatic event, right? Or something that's very, very happy. What happens in our body when those things happen? The endocrine system sends out hormones in our body, and it helps us to respond to certain stimulus in our environment. Okay, and the endocrine system again says it's another way to communicate. Right. So the endocrine system, just another way to communicate. It consists of glands that can secrete chemicals into the bloodstream to help help control all of our bodily function. We talked about in part one of this lecture the neurotransmitters that are submitted, chemical signals that are transmitted from one neuron to the next. You have dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, acetylcholine. All of these are chemicals that are used to submit and transmit information from one neuron to the next. The endocrine system, it transmits or sends chemicals that again help our bodily functions, right? They are in the bloodstream and they help our bodily functions. Much of the endocrine system is controlled by our nervous system through the hypothalamus. We talked about the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is really, really important for, again, the pituitary gland and controlling a lot of the things that we see. So the emotional responses, the hypothalamus is really, really responsible for that. All of the hormones that are in our body are controlled and sent out by, for the most part, by the hypothalamus. And hormones are just those chemical substances that are released by the endocrine glands, and then they are chemical messengers that our other organs use. Our brain sends information. The hypothalamus uh, activates the pituitary gland. Pituitary gland sends out information. Other glands in our body, the adrenal glands, we'll talk about those other glands in our body, they send out hormones to help with our bodily functions. When you get nervous, there are glands that are secreted so that it helps cortisol and adrenaline. When I'm in a fight or flight response, adrenaline is being released in my system to help me prepare for whatever it is I'm facing. Okay. One of the popular hormones that is released by the pituitary gland and regulates kind of the reproductive behaviors is oxytocin. Oxytocin is considered what we call the love drug or the love hormone, and it's really, really important for the rearing of children. We talk about the formation of relationships with your loved ones. When we are around people that we love, oxytocin is being released, and it helps us to feel that love, that rush of love and support and nurturing. That's what happens when loved ones get together. Oxytocin is being released, and that's why we feel that warmth um, when we're around people that we really, really love. Okay, so again, oxytocin is that hormone is produced in the hypothalamus, and then it's released into the bloodstream by the pituitary gland. It facilitates childbirth. So when mothers are experiencing the childbirth process, oxytocin is being released in their system to help to prepare their body to give birth to their loved one, right? And then when they first hold their offspring, they love the young person, again, they feel this release of oxytocin in their body, and it's a connection that they get and their child gets. So oxytocin is extremely important in the bonding of two people together, loved ones, mother and child, father and child. That's why touching is really, really important. Oxytocin is also released in exercise and music, and so that feel good that we get when we experience something really, really fun, nice, is oxytocin being released in the system. Also, dopamine, which is another hormone that is released uh, into our system through uh, other glands in our body. So again, the endocrine system is a system made up of different glands located throughout the body. You have the thyroid gland, you have the liver, adrenal glands, pancreas, kidney. All of these different glands secrete different hormones for, again, different bodily functions. Again, the hypothalamus is kind of at the center that helps to, again, send messages to other glands in the body to secrete hormones that are necessary for the function of the body. The endocrine hormones help control our mood. They help control our growth in our body. So you have growth hormones that are released, uh, development, the way our organs work, metabolism, reproduction, all of those things are controlled by and through the hypothalamus and through the endocrine system. Okay. So it says, which part of the endocrine system is considered to be responsible for fostering trust in humans, as well as openness and war? And I just kind of hit on it again when we talked about uh, loved ones and mother and child. There's a hormone that is released, and that hormone is called oxytocin. Right? Research suggests that, again, it fosters the feelings of openness and warmth, and it promotes social bonding between people, not just family members, but friends. Again, oxytocin is being released when you're bonding with people that really, really care about. So one of the last units that we'll talk about is, again, heredity. How does heredity uh, influence our behavior? And how, what are the genes? Right? Is it all about genes, or is the environment that we're brought up in, does that explain some of our behavior as well? And what we've learned over the course of the last century or so is that there is a connection or integration between our genetics and our environment, and they work together to influence how we behave, our feelings, our thought processes, some of the diseases and disorders that we develop. A lot of that is based on genes and the environment playing a kind of a balancing role together. Okay, so here are some of the basic principles of genetics. Okay, when we talk about genetics, one of the basic building blocks is what we call the chromosome. Right on the screen here, you see on the right-hand side of the screen, different chromosomes are responsible for different traits, right, that we experience. The genes are a part of the DNA that is in the chromosome. So genes are located in the chromosomes. The chromosomes are about 37 trillion cells in our body, and these chromosomes are found in all of those different cells. We got all types of different cells, brain cells, lung cells, all different type heart cells, all of those different cells, again, contribute to the functioning of our body and the traits that are developed by them. Every normal cell contains 3 pairs of chromosomes and 3 pairs of chromosomes. There's 23 pairs of chromosomes, so 23 times 2 gives me the 46 chromosomes that, again, make up who we are as people, okay? The DNA segments that serve as the key function for any hereditary transmission of anything that we have. So our hair color, our eye color, how tall we are, all those types of things. Our intelligence sometimes is contributed through the gene expression. But again, all of those things are really, really important. And genes have 4 different functions. The first one is they are building something. So they're building some kind of material in our body, building our the muscles and the bones and all of those different things. Then it helps our body do something. So being able to move, genes in our body are helping our body to do something, to function in an optimal way. They indirectly support bodily function. So the genes in our body support bodily function. And then the last thing is our physical characteristics. So genes are also responsible for, again, how we look, right? Your mom and your dad have certain genes, and we talk about some traits in our body, some traits that we have. So hair color, eye color, skin color, all of those are contributed through the combination of different genes that are shared from our parents to us. Okay, the XY chromosome is really, really important. So women have 2 X chromosomes, men have an X and a Y chromosome. So when a female is born, the male either contributes their X chromosome, and XX chromosomes create a female child, and the XY chromosome creates a male child. So the male is contributing to the sex of the child. Okay. When we talk about genes, one of the most important parts of the gene expression is, again, the polygenic traits. And any physical characteristics that are influenced by more than one pair of genes, that is what we call a polygenic traits. And some of the most common polygenic traits: skin and hair color, height, eye color, the risk for diseases, hypertension, diabetes, sickle cell anemia, the intelligence, blood pressure, bipolar disorder, autism, longevity. All of these are polygenic traits. And again, we get them from both of our parents. And with the genetic traits that we experience, the environment also plays a role, and we'll talk about that next, right? The different combination of the genes, that explains why family members aren't all alike, where we all have unique traits, right? We might have the same eye color, but we might have different hair thickness, and the texture of our hair may be different. Our height is different. My mom is 5'6", my dad is about 5'10", and so I'm about 5'7", 5'8". I'm kind of right in the middle, so I don't look like them. I kind of resemble them, but I don't look exactly like them. But there are overlappings in these combinations that explain the overlapping, and the combination of those genes explains why family members do resemble one another. So you may look like your sister, but you don't look exactly like your sister, because, again, the gene expression is not all the same. Okay. One of the biggest ways, and we'll see over the course of the next several chapters, one way we determine if genetics plays a big role in our behavior, in our intelligence, in the diseases that are passed from generation to generation, is based on how the studies in families, right? So we have adoption studies, we have family studies, and we have twin studies. Adoption studies allows us to look at kind of the biological and the the environmental factors and how that might influence uh, the development of a particular hereditary or gene expression, right? So when we talk about hereditary influence, we examine the resemblance between the adopted child and their biological and their adoptive parents, right? So is the environment that a person grows up in, do they become more like their adoptive parents, or they grow up in an entirely different household? So do some of the traits and some of their characteristics that they exhibit, maybe their personality, their intelligence, does that match their biological parent, even though they didn't grow up with their biological parent, right? So is it the environment that they're growing up in, or is it their parents that are contributing to some of the characteristics and traits that are exhibited through the individual child, right? Then you have family studies, and this is when we talk about hereditary influences assessed by examining just blood relatives to see how much of the traits resemble one another based in the family, right? Do all the siblings, equally intelligent, or is one sibling more intelligent than the next? Does the mom or is the mom intelligent? Did she graduate from Harvard, and her child is intelligent enough to go to Harvard because of that, right? Those are how we do family studies. And then the last piece is one of the major pieces is hereditary and twin studies. And we look at identical twins and we look at fraternal twins. Identical twins share almost 100% of their genetic makeup. And if one twin is intelligent, right, does that mean that the other identical twin will be intelligent? And then, fraternal twins share about half of their genetic makeup. And so we look at those respective traits to see if the genes play a major role. And again, twin studies are important because oftentimes twins grow up in the same environment. So the environment is the same. So then genetics has to play a role, right? So if we control for all the environmental factors, right, that twins experience in the same household, then we have to look at the genetics to see if the genetics are playing a role in how genes are being expressed. Okay. So again, detecting hereditary influence. This is kind of research that's been done for fraternal and identical twins. But fraternal twins provide a useful comparison to identical twins because again, they grow up in consistent environmental conditions. They grow up in the same household with the same parents or in a single parent household. And here are some examples of twin studies that have been done for certain characteristics or traits. So for intelligence, it looks like for identical twins, they share more in IQ than fraternal twins. So about the correlation of the scores, so about 0.85. So the correlation is really, really high. If a identical twin has an IQ, the other twin is going to have a high IQ versus a 0.6 correlation for our fraternal twins, right? So if one of the fraternal twins has a higher IQ, there's a greater likelihood that the other fraternal twin will, but it's higher in identical twins. Personality, right? Extroversion. If the identical twin is extroverted, there's a higher likelihood that there's a correlation. If they score high on the extroversion scale, then there's a high correlation of the identical twin scoring high on that scale as well. And then it's less so for personality, right? So you see that personality is a little less determined by genetics than intelligence is, right? Personality may also have to do with the environment that a person grows up in, right? If you grow up in a very, very open, supportive, nurturing family, then you might be a little more extroverted than if you grew up in a really dysfunctional family where you can't be as extroverted, as friendly, as open, right? And so again, that plays a big role. Okay, but identical twins again share more genetic kinship than fraternal twins, and so we see that there is some correlation between those characteristics, those traits. Okay. One other, again, key that we talk about is the interplay or the connection that happens between heredity and the environment. And epigenetics is the study of those heritable changes in gene expression that do not involve modifications to the DNA sequence, right? So how does our environment play a big role in how our genes are expressed? And that is really, really important, right? Many of us are predisposed to various things that we might be aware of. Maybe our grandmother and mom experience high blood pressure, hypertension, and high cholesterol, or diabetes, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that we will experience it ourselves, right? Our environment and the way we move, our behaviors, they can all influence the gene expression, right? So we might be predisposed to it, but it doesn't mean that that's our destiny, right? We can change our diet. We can change, our environment where, our diet, the amount of stress we get, the nurturing that we've had in our environment, right? All of those different things explain and can explain why some genes express in a certain way and others do not, right? So it says here in the first bullet, it says specific genes effects can be dampened or silenced by chemical events at cellular level, leading to alterations in traits, health, and behavior. So it's really about the gene expression can be dampened or silenced based on the environment that we're in. If we're in a really stress-filled environment and our diets aren't really good, then there's a likelihood that we might develop hypertension or high blood pressure or diabetes because of the environment that we're growing up in and our behaviors that we've adopted, right? But again, these chemical events can either stimulate or kind of again dampen it, right? But again, these epigenetic marks they influence the gene expression that can be passed down, right? So if my mom struggled with anxiety or depression, um, it depends on my experience, my lived environment, right? If I live in an environment where I'm not having to deal with a lot of the stressors that my mom had to deal with, and she's really, really nurturing, and my stress level and my diet is really, really optimal, then I may not deal with anxiety and depression in the same way that she did, right? Or if my family deals with obesity, mom and my grandmother were obese, but I'm not obese because I changed the way my diet is, I changed my environment, and I operate different in my environment, so I don't have that expression of that gene in my body, right? So this last piece is really, really important. It says genes confer dispositions, not destiny, right? So we may have a predisposition to something, right? Maybe a predisposition to a mental illness or mental disorder or to some other ailments or comorbidities, but that does not contribute to our ultimate destiny, right? We have an opportunity to change that based on our environment and how we operate our behaviors and the health of the individual. Okay? So it says Carla's skin tone is influenced by more than one pair of genes. It says this means that skin tone is what kind of trait? And we discussed uh, only one of these in this list. So the answer should be pretty obvious, but any um, uh, any influence in traits that is kind of influenced by more than one pair of genes, that is going to be what we call a polygenic trait. Okay, single pair of genes determines a trait. However, most humans and most human characteristics appear to be polygenic, or characteristics that are influenced by more than one pair of genes. Other organisms may have a single pair of genes that contributes to a trait and determines a trait, but most of our human characteristics are polygenic. Okay. All right. The last thing we'll talk about is the evolutionary basis of behavior. How does behavior change over time? Charles Darwin, an evolutionary psychologist or scientist, he wanted to determine how different characteristics of species change over generations and why these changes are adaptive, right? And that's what he discovered, right? Over the course of time, um, different characteristics, different traits are passed down from generation to generation because they are adaptive and allow us to survive. And so aggression in individuals and uh, being extroverted, being a people person, being altruistic is really helpful in situations where you want to build a community. And so those characteristics, those traits are passed down from generation to generation because they allow us to survive. Having harmony and building relationships with other people is really, really important. So if you are extroverted, and you are someone who is not as neurotic, then you're going to survive because, again, you're more of a people person. People want to be around you, and so you survive. And so those characteristics are really, really important. But fitness is that, again, reproductive success. So individuals who are stronger, who are more fit, who are healthier, who are more intelligent, oftentimes those individuals are going to pass down their traits from one population to the next. So fitness was that number of descendants of an individual organism relative to the average reproductive success of the population, right? So those who are stronger, those who are a little more dominant, survive because they, again, have the characteristics to be able to adapt to their environment at a different level. Natural selection is that what we talk about, where a characteristic uh, is more likely to be passed down to subsequent generations because it is selected over time because it's adaptive, right? We'll talk about several different characteristics. So being able to stand upright, being able to communicate via language, that's been passed down from generation to generation because it allows us to be able to solve problems and survive in a very different way. That's why we're able to live in homes and solve complex issues because, again, as humans, a lot of the traits, that the intelligence, all that's been passed down from generation and is a hereditable characteristic that's passed down from generation to generation. And again, natural selection is based on it surviving from one generation to the next. Skin color, our eye color, muscle tone, all of those things are passed down because we need those things to survive. And again, one of the biggest pieces we talk about natural selection is adaptation. How do people adapt to their environment? Right? Adaptation is an inherited characteristic, and it increased the population because it helped survival and reproduction during the time it emerged. Right. So here are five kind of remarkable adaptations that have happened over the course of time that have helped us to survive. So endurance running. We don't like running, right? But if we had to run, we would, right? People run 5Ks and marathons now, and they're able to do that because of an adaptation from uh, from way back in the prehistoric times. When people needed to hunt for food, it was really, really important that endurance running came into play because if we were chasing a bison, buffalo, or just any type of prey that ran for long distances, we're able to run for long distances because we have the endurance running, right? We can sweat, we can run for a long distance of time, whereas other animals aren't able to run for a longer distance of time. When we look at the cheetah can only run for 60 miles per hour, for a very short amount of time, and then it overheats, and then it has to slow down, and then it has to stop and to recover. But as a human being, we can run for long distance of time, and the bison or whatever the prey is, they get tired. We don't, and then once they get tired, they have to rest. Then we're able to catch them, and then to kill them for food. Sweating is another thing. Sweating, again, goes hand in hand with endurance running. Since we're able to sweat, our bodies don't overheat. And since our bodies don't overheat, we're able to stay active a lot longer. And that's why endurance running we're able to endurance run because we are able to cool ourselves off in a more efficient way than other animals are. Other animals aren't able to, and so they get tired. My dog has to pant because he can't sweat. He doesn't have sweat glands, and so he has to stop running after a while because he just can't run for that long distance of time. Standing upright, obviously, it gives us many advantages. We're able to reach things that other animals aren't able to. We're able to climb, and our sense of balance is very, very different. So animals that are able to stand, to walk upright, they have an advantage over animals that have to be on all fours at all times and don't have that center of gravity. Hearing tuned speech, obviously, being able to communicate with tuned speech, we're able to communicate emotions and feelings and problem solve. We're able to meet amongst a group of people to share ideas and perspectives, and that helps us to, again, dominate society. And obviously, great teeth. Some of our teeth are straighter than others, but again, we have great teeth, and that helps us to, again, chew things and bite down on different, carnivorous like meats and vegetables and other things that we need our teeth for again, for adaptation, for survival. Okay. But again, these are kind of those later refinements, right? We got adaptation, we have natural selection. Some of those characteristics are passed down because they are adaptive. They help us to survive, and it gives us more of a chance to reproduce, right? If we can survive, we reproduce, and then those genes and those characteristics, those traits are passed down from one generation to the next. Okay. And then one thing I'll go back when we talk about epigenetics. We always talk about how generations of the past passed down certain traits. And it has been studied that epigenetics is, when we talk about the slavery and how genes that were passed down from our ancestors who were in slavery are passed down to us. And we don't always experience some of the same stressors, but some of the stress that we do experience mimic some of the things that they experienced, some of the chronic stress and the traumatic events in their life. Again, they experience different gene expressions, and those genes are passed down to us. And you know, the a lot of the expressions that we have with anxiety and stress and depression, oftentimes that has been passed down from generation to generation. You have to understand that during that time, stress, anxiety, it wasn't a new thing. You know, they experienced stress, anxiety, depression, mental disorders, the same that we did. We have labels for those things now, but those things are passed down from generation to generation, and their environment played an even harsher role in their development, their brain development, their intelligence, and the environment that we've been able to improve upon has helped us to get past some of the kind of the deficiencies in some of the other generations, right? That's why generation after generation, intelligence has improved because the environment we're in helps us to improve our generation with the different technologies that we have. I mean, smartphones and better medical care and all those different things help us to pass down better genes to our offspring. Okay. All right, so we'll end there. The last thing I'll talk about is those themes. We talked about those themes over the course of the chapters. Heredity and environment jointly influence behavior. That's going to be something that we talk about from nature versus nurture. The impact of genetic makeup depends on the environment, right? The impact of the environment depends on the genetic makeup, so they work kind of in tandem. There's an interplay between those two things. Behavior is determined by multiple causes. Our environment and our genetics plays a big role in how we behave, how we think. Our parents play a big role in the environment that they've set up for us. And just us as people, genetically, we exhibit certain traits based on who we are. And again, what's passed down from generation to generation. There are, again, an array of biological factors that involve the development of different mental disorders. And we'll talk about that in chapter 14 and chapter 15. We'll talk about those psychological disorders and kind of what contributes to them. Psychology is empirical, right? So the research that we've seen, empiricism, we have to observe things and then make observations to see, okay? We use an fMRI technology, imaging technique to see what parts of the brain are active when someone is watching something very stimulating, visually stimulating. We look at what parts of the brain are activating when someone is talking to us. So the temporal lobe is firing, right? So we're making those observations with research and collecting data. And we've been doing that for the last century or more. Okay? And then it says when researchers find out how to better observe something, their findings usually facilitate major advances in scientific knowledge. So we were able to, again, in the very, very early times, we would damage part of the brain to see how damaging part of the brain would affect our functioning. And now we're using different imaging techniques to now find out, what parts of the brain are responsible for, hearing and sight and our emotions, our thinking, our rational thought. The right hemisphere, the left hemisphere. Are those the right hemisphere and left hemisphere? What are they specialized for? We're able to determine that because researchers have been able to observe the different ways that they function. Okay, but we'll stop there. This is chapter 3, part 2. And again, we'll move on to chapter 4, sensation and perception, in our next lecture.